Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this WFA Spotlight on preparing for digital media's privacy first future. Obviously a big topic, an enormous topic, and one we've dealt with quite a bit at the WFA. It's something we're covering in various communities within our media forum, within our digital governance exchange, within our privacy action group and other places besides. So a big topic. And indeed, we've done previous sessions, webinars like this in the past with guest speakers, and we'll be doing more as well. It's obviously a space which is evolving very, very rapidly. Announcements on privacy changes as recently as today. So more to follow here. Today, we are lucky to have two great guest speakers with us. We have Katie and James, both from within the Omnicom Media Group. So we'll be handing over to these guys shortly. Before we do, introductions from the WFA team. My name is Matt. I'm Director for Global Media at WFA. And I'm joined by my colleague, Hannah, who's really the driving force behind all our events at WFA. I think you're probably all fairly familiar with this. But worth pointing out, I think, that WFA has two types of member. There are 60 national advertiser associations within our membership. And I think I've seen ACA Canada, CAA Argentina, and other associations joining. So welcome to you if you're from a national association or if you're a member of a national association. We also have corporate members within the WFA, of which there are about 130 now. And on screen, you can see both types of member represented with all your logos here. So welcome one and all. Now to the topic, this slide looks at the priorities of the WFA Media Forum in 2021. What you told us, ranked out of 7. And you could argue the toss on this, but it's my view that most of these are, to a lesser or greater extent, impacted by the changes we're seeing manifested by data privacy. Measurement, clearly very much, attribution in particular. What platforms? Well, they're in the middle of all of this. Cross-device tracking, programmatic, yes. So, it really is affecting so much of the ecosystem. I think this member says it well when she explains with privacy and cookies changing, we need to be focused on ensuring our digital strategy is built for the evolving landscape. And that's what this session is all about. It's about trying to help you understand what the changes are and helping you understand how you can prepare for those. Here's another resource which might help you prepare. It's our recent opinion piece on the future of data-driven marketing. You can download that from the URL at the bottom there. Basically, the document is one which seeks to help understand the context from where all this unprecedented change comes from. And clearly there are three very powerful forces amidst which advertisers find themselves, and those are societal changes and consumer expectation, which is kind of driving changes in regulation, which is in turn driving changes in the market and amongst platforms. So, advertisers are very much in the middle of this. Clearly, we fund much of the market, the platforms. So we have a role. And I would suggest that, as we prepare for these changes, I do think it's appropriate that we look for outcomes which are good for our brands and good for business, but also consider, whether those changes are good for consumers and society more broadly. Let's take an ethical approach to the ecosystem going forward. And that's a good segue to my speakers. We have Katie Eyton, who is the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Omnicom Media Group, and James Aylett, who's the Managing Director for Technology at Annalect. So I'll just hand over to them. But before I do, I did want to take the opportunity to launch a very quick poll here to take the pulse of all of you on this webinar today. All right, good. Well, that is good. That's actually pretty encouraging. Not so many who are nowhere with this. 2/3 of you are actively planning for it and working on it. Good. That's good to see. Very good. Brilliant. All right. Well, that is the segue I was looking for, actually, to hand over to James, who's going to kick off. What do you think about that, James?
I think that's certainly encouraging. It's entirely possible, I think, if you've experienced this year, to keep on getting caught in the headlights of new announcements coming along as they come along every week or 2 weeks and not quite knowing how to get started. So getting started is probably the most important thing to do. because once you've started, you can continue to evolve and take into account new things as they come along. I think if you had waited too long to try and get a perfect approach, then you would run the risk of not taking advantage of new opportunities that work today, even as they'll continue to work post cookies and with the evolution of mobile and so forth, but also to make sure that you have a good understanding of the opportunities that are going to continue to be available to you over time. So thanks, Matt, and hi everyone. There's two halves to this session, and first we're going to look at why so much is changing, what some of the changes are in detail, and how the industry is adapting, the kind of new functionality and capabilities that's being built in everything from ad tech to web browsers and mobile operating systems. And secondly, we'll look at some practical implications for that, how common digital media technologies and techniques are going to have to evolve. So where you're doing one thing today, and you may achieve the same thing in a different way tomorrow. We don't have much time, so let's dive straight in. We can think of digital advertising. Matt said earlier that there's societal changes, that's causing regulatory changes, that's causing industry changes. And we can think of, therefore, of the actual pressures on the practice of digital advertising as coming from two areas. And on the top of this, we've got the regulatory changes, and this is really just some of the key things that have happened over the last 5 years. There are obviously more details that have appeared across this time span, and there are more that are happening now, and we already have timelines for the introduction of new regulation. And then at the bottom, you've got what the major technology vendors, Google and Apple, have been doing, both in response to the regulatory changes, but also in response to the societal changes and the fact that more and more people are thinking about privacy and demanding it of their technology, of their devices, and so forth. We've also noted on this the point where the Trade Desk announced Unified ID 2, which we'll come back to in a little bit of time. A key thing here, though, is we don't bother updating this chart that often because it changes almost every week, and it will continue to change. We are in the middle of probably the most intense period of evolution around data privacy that we're likely to see, because we're moving from a place where 20 years ago it was almost not an issue for the vast majority of people and the vast majority of use cases and industries, to a situation where we get there in maybe 10 years, where we have a well understood, settled legal approach and societal and cultural approach to it, and then technology and industries following that appropriately. More regulations coming to force, and Apple and Google are going to keep on announcing more things. They've both announced new things in the last 2 weeks. They're going to announce new things. They've already said, both of them, that future versions of their mobile operating systems will contain more privacy features as well. So that will keep on happening. Katie.
Cool. So those of you who operate in Europe will already be aware that under the existing e-privacy directive, consent is required both for cookies, but also for other digital identifiers, including things like mobile ad IDs, fingerprinting, tracking pixels, HTML5 storage, and so on. And that consent needs to be to the GDPR standard, which means that it needs to be freely given, it needs to be specific, it needs to be informed, and it needs to be unambiguous. That consent also has to be demonstrated through a clear affirmative action, which in practical terms means that you need a proactive opt-in to tracking. And it's also probably just worth pointing out that this consent is required even when no personal data is being processed. And the reason that I'm highlighting these points is because they apply not just to current tracking approaches, like cookies and mobile ad IDs, but also to those solutions which are being introduced as future alternatives. And of course, if your online tracking is processing personal data, then you're also subject to the GDPR. And on the subject of GDPR, while these regulations obviously apply to everyone, I think it's sort of fair to say that to date, it has been the big platforms who've probably faced the most scrutiny from the regulators. And yesterday's news of a $425 million potential fine for Amazon, I think, is a very timely reminder of that. And to sort of further illustrate the point, I've included this slide from the Irish regulator, who is the lead regulator in Europe for a lot of these companies. And it shows the different multinational tech company investigations that have been started since the GDPR came into force in 2018. It's actually not fully up to date. There have been a few more since then. But you'll notice that actually only one of these has reached the final decision phase so far. So I think there is a lot of news, a lot of developments still to come in this area. And you'll see on this how much of a focus, the likes of Google and Apple are. And so I think it's perhaps unsurprising that these big platforms have started taking things into their own hands and are really spearheading the new privacy initiatives. And we're going to talk very briefly about some of these initiatives, starting with Apple's app tracking transparency. Most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with this already. It requires mobile apps to seek consent if they want to track users. And as you know, this requirement, it applies not just to mobile identifiers, but also to other forms of data, such as email addresses. There's been quite a bit of backlash against this from some elements of the industry who say that the requirements go too far. But leaving aside some of the competition considerations, which I'm not going to address here, if you look at their policy alongside that GDPR consent requirement, and particularly the need for opt-in consent, I do think it's sort of easier to understand why Apple have gone down the route that they have with ATT. So now let's just have a quick look at the industry rollout and consumer response to this. So I guess perhaps the first thing to say is just a quick reminder of where Apple sits in terms of its market share. And they have around 26% of the global operating system market for mobile. And of those users, so far, nearly 46% have upgraded to iOS 14.5 or iOS 14.6. And there's been a big increase in the last week. But that means that those are the people who will be seeing the ATT tracking prompts where these have been implemented. And so far, what we're hearing from the app analytics companies is that about 22% of developers have implemented ATT within their apps. There has been some analysis in the trade press recently suggesting that some developers are starting to deploy workarounds for this. So using device and network information, so things like IP addresses as an example, to determine user identities where that consent is not given. And I think it'll be interesting to see if and when Apple start more actively enforcing their policies. But I suspect that they will enforce it because so far at least, consumers don't appear to be all that keen on tracking, with only 15% opting in when they're shown that ATT prompt. We don't have clear data yet on whether some of the pre-notification pop-ups are having a significant impact on those opt-in rates, but that's definitely something that we're going to watch with interest, I think, for the future. But when then you look at the impact of ATT on spend, what we've seen is that app install campaign spend fell during the run-up to the launch, but it has subsequently increased sort of back to pre-launch and even slightly above the pre-rollout levels. And the reason that that's important, because unless you're adjusting for this, removing Apple users from your marketing plans will have an impact on overall audience composition. So here in the UK, for example, Apple users are more likely to be female, and they tend to be more upmarket than the majority of Android users. But I'd really urge everyone to explore this for your own markets when you're weighing up how to respond to these changes and what the implications are for platform spend. So I mentioned a minute ago that some developers are trying to circumvent these tracking restrictions by using IP address and other signals to probabilistically identify devices. Well, I think that's probably going to be quite a short-lived approach. When iOS 15 comes out in the autumn, Apple is introducing changes to hide users' IP addresses from trackers. So this was one of the recent announcements that James mentioned earlier. And that is going to have quite a big implication, I think, for some of the companies that are operating in the space and some of the post-cookie solutions that we're going to go on to talk about. But obviously, that's only the first step. Some of the other things that were announced, mail privacy protection, which is going to block the use of tracking pixels and emails. And then alongside that, hide my email, which is going to allow people to create random email addresses instead of sharing their real one. So potentially bad news there for some of the deterministic post-cookie identifiers. Interestingly as well, more transparency around privacy. So where people have granted permission for apps to access things like your location data, camera, microphone, and so on, the new app privacy report will enable users to see how often each app has actually used those things, as well as who that data has been shared with. And then finally, you've got private relay, which enables iCloud users to browse the web in a more private way by encrypting all the traffic that leaves a user's device and ensuring that no single entity, including Apple, can identify both who a user is and which sites they visit. So we're really continuing to see Apple doubling down on privacy. But of course, they're also not the only ones focusing their attention in this space. Android is also very much dialing up transparency and tracking permissions. And there have been two recent announcements from Google in this space. The first, which is the one that I think has got most of the headlines, is the removal of the Android ad ID for users who opt out of personalization. So at the moment, if you're opting out of ads personalization, the Android ad ID is accompanied by an opt-out flag. In future, attempts to access the ID for advertising purposes for opted out users will just return a sort of string of zeros. So it'll help prevent companies from circumventing the existing kind of Google policies on this. I also think it's quite interesting that they're talking about this as an opt-out rather than Apple's opt-in approach. And it'll be interesting to see whether that position evolves at all, particularly in Europe. So that change coming into effect in Q4 of this year for Android 12 devices, and then Q1 next year for all other devices. Alongside this, there's another initiative which is focused on transparency, which is kind of like Android's version of the Apple data nutrition labels. So at this stage, Android have just given us a very top line heads up that this is coming, and the detailed policy is expected to be released in Q3 this year. From Q4, developers will be able to start declaring the relevant information in the Google Play console. And then from Q2 next year, all new and existing apps will have to declare the information. So I'm not going to read all of this out. We will share a copy of the deck, but I think it's fair to say that in line with their respective business models, Apple is focusing primarily on cross-site tracking and data sharing with their transparency and their consent models, whereas Android is placing a greater emphasis on data safety and security. So slightly different approaches, but all moving in a sort of more transparent direction. So privacy continues to be a hot topic, and that's 144 countries worldwide now have a national privacy law. Within the EU specifically, informed opt-in consent is required for digital tracking. And I think it's fair to say that the big platforms are going to continue to come under significant pressure from regulators. And maybe a cynic might also say that they are seeing not insignificant commercial benefits from some of these new privacy initiatives. But irrespective, we are also seeing, I think, a growing consumer appetite for privacy controls and a relatively limited appetite for data sharing. No doubt there are plenty of companies that will try and subvert user choices around tracking, but I think with regulatory scrutiny on the one hand and new initiatives from the platforms on the other, my view is that these have a very limited lifespan and are not necessarily going to be a long-term solution to the changes which are taking place. Yeah, I think it's generally pretty fair to say, I think, that the days of persistent mobile identifiers and the kind of cross-platform tracking that we all know today, that time is coming to a close. And of course, as we're all very well aware, it isn't just mobile identifiers that are under threat.
Thanks, Katie. On outside mobile, a lot of digital advertising has depended on third-party cookies to provide that cross-site identity that's used for everything from targeting to measurement, but they are dying. They're gone already in Safari, in Firefox, and Chrome, as I'm sure everyone remembers, announced in January last year that they will kill them off as well, currently planned at some time next year. They're not very precise about dates because they want to make sure that they have alternatives available. The Chrome team have proposed a set of technologies to serve advertising use cases while achieving better privacy for consumers. And this is called Privacy Sandbox. And I just want to note in passing, and it's following up one of Katie's last points, the Chrome team, like quite a lot of internet technologists, see this kind of cross-site pervasive tracking that has happened within the digital advertising industry for a number of years as a security threat that then comes around and surfaces as a privacy issue. And so some of the measures in Privacy Sandbox are tackling it very much from a security analysis point of view. Others are to serve specific use cases. And they'd like their proposals to be adopted by other browsers because Chrome is fairly committed to an open and fully interoperable web. They like to add a couple of extra features to make it easier to use their browser, but they don't want to make it so that websites only work on particular browsers or you have to code them to. People who were around in the 90s may remember what a pain that was. So what they did when they started the Privacy Sandbox proposals is they took them to W3C and started discussing them in the open. W3C is the web standard body, and this is quite a well-established approach to discussing new proposed internet technologies and web technologies, but it is a slow process. And for people, particularly within the advertising industry, who are not used to it, it can be frustrating to observe from the outside, to understand what's going on. And particularly it can be quite difficult to really understand the current status. Google are committed to improving their transparency around the current status of everything that's going on, and we'll see how that evolves over time. Privacy Sandbox is actually a lot of proposals, but on the next slide, we've highlighted 5 in particular. We're going to talk mostly about the ones on the left, Flock and Fledge, which are designed for targeting use cases. And we'll touch on some of the measurement ideas in the middle. But I just wanted to note that they're not ignoring, or they're not attempting to ignore, any significant use cases. So there are fraud detection measures and APIs to deal with that, as well as a whole load of stuff to try and make fingerprinting harder and to provide a framework to avoid fingerprinting from being able to work in future versions of the browser. But Privacy Sandbox will not be the only game in town. Contextual approaches on the left are still going to work, and there's actually been a lot of innovation here in the last few years. If you're not aware, Katie will talk a little bit about some of that in a bit. And advertisers will still be able to load CRM lists and similar using PII into the large platforms to target and measure within the walled gardens. And then on the right of this diagram, there are a number of new addressable media identifiers, AMIs, that don't rely on third-party cookies in order to function. Deterministic identity, such as LiveRamp or Unified ID2, relies on some sort of common PII. So it's somewhat similar to the direct PII matching, but it generates an interoperable identifier. That does mean that it is potentially threatened by one of those iOS 15 features that Katie mentioned earlier. Probabilistic identifiers, on the other hand, rely on a range of information such as timestamp, IP addresses, and information about the browser or device in order to assign an identifier that is likely to represent a single person over time. IP address there is another thing that is threatened by some of the iOS 15 features. So both of them are going to be, to some extent, under attack from where Apple is trying to move. Let's dig into those last two a little bit more. You've probably heard of Unified ID2 or UID2. It was started originally by Trade Desk and is now becoming an industry-wide approach with stewardship from the IAB Tech Lab and PRAM, which is the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media. Katie, can you move on one slide? Thank you. Unified ID2 is a declared or deterministic identifier, so it works off an email address. If you've got an email address and you've got the consent to use it, then you'll be able to turn that into a unified ID2 or an encrypted token, depending on the sort of person you are in the ecosystem for security reasons. And that can be passed around the bid stream and used in place of a third-party cookie identifier. And it's also interoperable. One possible use of it that is being talked about at the moment is a way of connecting different proprietary identifiers, of which there are a lot. And so it is really important for the success of something like UID2 to be able to be integrated with a number of different players. And they've announced a whole load of different integrations on the sell side, on the buy side, on data and measurement partners, and for a number of publishers. And for instance, one of the interoperability things that it will enable is it'll be possible to transact against UID2 against supply that was generated with LiveRamp's ATS, for instance. So one system that has its own identity space, providing it is interoperable with Unified ID2, you'll be able to buy using one of the different spaces. And you don't have to have all publishers implement all of the different competing identity spaces. That's going to be important for scale. So let's look instead at a probabilistic identifier. This is Universal ID by ID5. There are a few different approaches, but this one is quite easy to talk about because they've made a lot of information public, including this diagram, which is quite helpful. It's still based on a deterministic core. That's how they build the models and the systems they're using at the top. But it then uses other signals. And on the right-hand side, there's a whole load of different signals that it uses, plus machine learning to achieve a much greater scale. And that's that middle inferred IDs section of their triangle. Not everyone is going to be prepared to provide their email address, and not all publishers will want to ask, and not all brands will have a reason to capture an email address either, at least until that model is better proven. So deterministic likely won't reach the entire population, and certainly won't reach the whole of addressable inventory. However, ID5 are banking on their universal ID approach, reaching many more people and a much higher proportion of that inventory. It is worth noting at the bottom, they are identifying that there will always be anonymous users, people who are deliberately blocking these things or are opting out, or in Europe are not opting in the first place to the identity system being able to process their data. So there's always going to be some portion that cannot be identified. And they note that there are other techniques that will be used there. It's worth noting that different technologies and different identifier systems will be supported by different DSPs, although most will support flock cohorts from Chrome's privacy sandbox, as well as contextual and related techniques. For AMIs, we would expect there to be a little bit more variation. Some of those vendors that have ticks against one-to-one activation might only support one of the ID approaches. Obviously, if they support something like Unified ID2, then all of the things that it's interoperable with will also be supported. But most notably, DV360 isn't going to support any AMIs, and Google has been very clear about that a number of times, I think to the point where they feel slightly frustrated that people don't believe them. But they've said absolutely DV360 for the open web will not be able to transact on one-to-one identity.
So yeah, lots to take in. To help unpick some of this, we're now going to just have a really quick look at how these changes affect some of the sort of common marketing use cases. And just to flag that this is a super abridged version of what was originally a 3-hour training session. So we're not going to be able to cover everything in a huge amount of detail, but if anybody would like more information on anything, we do have content on these other areas. So please do feel free to get in touch with us after the session if that's the case. First off, though, let's just start with a quick update on tagging, as this typically sort of provides the foundations for a lot of other use cases that we'll be talking about. And the key thing to be aware of here is that if you're using legacy Google Stack technology, such as analytics.js, legacy Google Ads, conversion tags, and floodlights, then these are not going to work when Chrome stops supporting third-party cookies next year. Google's solution to this is what they call One Google Tag, which is effectively a rebrand of the G tag. And as you might have guessed from the name, it enables all Google tracking to be implemented via a single tag. It also uses first-party cookies set on your domain rather than third-party cookies in order to do this. If you're not aware of the One Google Tag, then your agencies almost certainly will be, and I'm sure they'll be able to help with any of the implementation process around this. There's also an issue which many of you in Europe will be acutely aware of, that the e-privacy consent requirements have led to a fall in available data volumes for many companies, with some losing as much as 90% of their data because of the enhanced opt-in requirements. So Google's solution to this is something called consent mode, which uses machine learning to provide modeled conversion reporting, estimating the number of unconsented conversions that should be attributed to advertising. And this data, this model data, is going to be available in GA4 from H2 of this year, but it's only going to be available in GA4, not the older Universal Analytics. It's a really great tool, but as we mentioned at the bottom of the slide, it does also require careful consideration of the privacy options and how these are presented to consumers. And some regulators, for example, the CNIL in France, have expressed initial concerns about consent mode tracking. So just to be aware of that. And the final point to make on all of this is, while you will need to upgrade if you're using legacy technology, you should still expect to see substantial changes going forward, because the Google platforms are still going to be subject to the wider privacy sandbox changes, which James mentioned earlier. So once you have your tagging and analytics in place, now let's just have a quick look at some activation use cases, starting with retargeting. So we're going to start off with the privacy sandbox solutions for retargeting. The original proposal for this was called Turtle Dove, and has now been superseded by Fledge, because as James mentioned, they really do like they like a good bird reference, does Google in the privacy sandbox. Yes. And so while retargeting will still be possible, there will be some notable changes, such as minimum segment size for retargeting. So this is going to particularly affect pages and tactics with lower traffic. And advertisers will still be able to target ads to people who visited a particular page of your website, but you won't be able to combine that with other information about those users that you've collected separately. So the other thing to be aware of is any reporting that relies on tying multiple events back to a single user is no longer going to be possible under some of these proposals. So that's going to affect things like optimal frequency analysis and sequential creatives. Also, just worth being aware that prior consent is still likely to be required under e-privacy regulations in Europe. And Chrome have also said that future updates are going to include greater transparency and control for users. Essentially, what they're going to do is to make it much easier for people to see who is retargeting them, and to enable them to opt out of that retargeting if they don't like it. And let's be honest here, when retargeting is done poorly, it can make people feel that someone is stalking them around the internet and sort of pestering them to buy something. So identifying a level of frequency which is effective without being intrusive, I think, is going to be really important if you want to keep people opted in for this activity.
There's a second type of retargeting that people commonly do at the moment, and that's prospecting to find people like the original retargeting segment. And Privacy Sandbox has a solution to this as well. It'll be possible using Flock, although it's a slightly complex use of Flock compared to some of the basic ones that Google is currently talking about. The idea behind Flock is that instead of having an individual person-based identifier, Chrome will group thousands of people together in individual, what are called cohorts. So one cohort containing many, many people, and each one of those cohorts has one of those white on green numbers in the middle. So we just know that it has a number. What you'll be able to do on your website is look at which cohorts are visiting different pages, and you can get a sense from that of which cohorts are interested in a particular product or a particular service, in much the same way that you would identify individual visitors for retargeting by their actions on your website. And then once you've got that list of cohorts, you can take that to your DSP and target them. We know that DV360 will support this directly, and we suspect that a large number of other DSPs will, although the details on exactly how you go about doing that are still up in the air as people are testing and building it. Both of those two use cases, those two different types of retargeting, will also be able to be achieved using an addressable media identifier such as UID2. And they will largely work as they do today using third-party cookies. So note that with UID2 and similar deterministic identifiers, you will need a consumer's email address in order to be able to put them into that segment that you're activating against. And that will limit scale for some sites. So you could look to a probabilistic identifier instead, so that you capture all of the people that are on your website rather than just those who've already given your email address. or instead there are some contextual scaling approaches that we'll look at a little bit later that might be able to help.
Cool. So moving on to interest-based targeting, and we're going to start by looking at a flock-based approach. So let's start here by quickly recapping the main differences between flock cohorts and the way we typically target today. So today we're used to this idea of kind of real one-to-one targeting and micro-segmentation, whereas each cohort must have a minimum of 1,000 people in it. And today, a consumer can be in multiple different targeting segments, but an individual can only be in one cohort at a time, although each cohort can be in multiple segments. Today, behavioral segments are typically created to reflect some sort of advertiser demand. So for example, an interest in travel or an intention to purchase a new car, for example. Whereas cohorts, on the other hand, are machine defined. So they're based on natural browsing patterns and not on marketing requirements. And whereas now data vendors perhaps offer different targeting segments to buy, cohort definitions, they're fixed. They're not going to change in quite the same way. Although, that said, different vendors may interpret that definition in different ways in order to create useful segments for advertisers to then activate against. One final thing just to note on this is that everything I've just sort of said relates to the Chrome flock proposal. We are starting to see some other data vendors talk about cohorts when they really mean ID-based segments, which I think is a little bit confusing. So if someone's trying to pitch a cohort-based targeting solution, it may be worth just double checking whether they mean that they're supporting flock or whether they're using a different interpretation of cohorts. So as you can see, there is some significant difference between cookie-based audiences and cohort-based audiences that are built on flocks. But despite that, I think the way we actually use cohorts in practice could actually end up being very similar to the way that we work with prepackaged interest groups today. So in today's world, each audience segment is made up of multiple individual cookie IDs, each of which kind of maps back to a single browser. Tomorrow, in the world of flock, each segment is going to be made up of multiple cohort IDs, and each of those cohort IDs contains many individual browsers. So while what the segment contains is going to be different, the way that you select and activate that segment through a DSP, for example, could end up staying in a quite similar way to what you're used to seeing and doing today.
And just as with retargeting, AMIs can also be used for behavioral and interest targeting. Brands or data providers with access to email addresses can build segments of UID2s in place of the cookies that they use today, or they can use probabilistic identifiers if PII is not available. And those identifiers can be recognized in the bid stream for targeting by a compatible DSP, pretty much exactly as we do with cookies at the moment, except without having to worry about matching between different cookie spaces. If we're using a deterministic identity, then there may be limited scale in the final segment, as I noted before. And if we can just move on one, please, Katie. That where today you might use lookalike modeling to expand the list of identifiers to include other similar consumers, another approach that's going to be possible is to use profiles of those identifiers, that list of UID2s, to build a contextual model based on content that the seed segment over-indexes on compared to the population. So that is identifying some particular contexts that are more likely to find you that target segment and people like that target segment than open buys, for instance, which will just get you everyone. And that allows contextual targeting to find all consumers on that content, which is a kind of contextual lookalike approach. We've just mapped out a specific example of this where a group of email addresses are converted into a UID2, and then the profile of how they browse contextual data around the web, whether fashion and travel content is particularly interesting for people who've requested a travel brochure, that will allow you to go and buy against those contexts to find similar people for prospecting in the future. This becomes even more powerful when working with some of the latest innovations in contextual targeting, which Katie's going to talk about for a minute now.
Yeah, it's definitely worth saying that traditional contextual targeting has had a bit of a makeover in recent months and years. And a lot of vendors are now creating much richer contextual targeting models, driven by things like natural language processing and machine learning techniques. So examples include being able to analyze the semantic content of a site or the page that you're on, but also the sort of the visual site layout and attention metrics, as well as things like sentiment-based metrics, which analyze both the overall page sentiment, but also whether a particular topic is portrayed in a positive or negative way. And then on top of this, you still have all of the macro levers that are already used today. So things like time of day, day of week, location, device type, weather, and so on, all of which can be really effective when they're tied back to strong audience insights. And I think that's one of the key things to think about when it comes to contextual. What do we already know about our consumers, and how does that inform our targeting? And also don't forget to tap into your premium publishers, who typically have a huge wealth of insight on the type of content, the language, the style that's going to best appeal to their audience. And I think linked to that, one of the things that sets really strong contextual campaigns apart is that ability for media and creative to work in synergy, so that the message resonates not just with the audience, but also with the content that it appears in. We've also, by the way, just outlined there on the bottom left, some of the things that we would typically look for as part of a contextual vendor appraisal, but obviously different brands will all have their own requirements. So really that's just a starting point for anyone who is interested. Facebook makes up a very significant portion of media spends for many advertising across many markets. So I just wanted to touch on this very briefly, and specifically to talk about their Conversions API solution, or CAPI as it's often referred to. And this enables an advertiser to send conversion information directly to Facebook, so via a server-to-server integration without the need for cookies. If you want, you can also share additional data with Facebook through this mechanism. So examples might include CRM data or offline conversion events, for instance. And data shared with Facebook through the Conversions API, it's still linked to your pixel, and it can be used for the same types of ad optimization and targeting that you would use the Facebook pixel for today. There are a couple of considerations for any brands who are looking to use Conversions API. The first being that it is considerably more complex to set up than the pixel deployment. And so we would recommend allowing at least 90 days for deployment as a result. And for those operating in the EU, you will also want to be aware that advertisers are considered to be joint controllers with Facebook for this activity, with all of the GDPR obligations that entails. Obviously, if you're going to go down this route working with CAPI, then you should engage your own privacy teams on this. We're pretty certain that consent would be required. And the reason I flag that is because few, if any, of the consent management platforms available today have an out-of-the-box solution for this. So again, it's going to require an element of custom development. And so because of all of these things, we would strongly recommend that if you're interested and if you think this is going to help solve some of the post-cookie challenges with Facebook measurement and targeting, that it could be good to put together a cross-discipline team to work on it right from the start, including both marketing, but also digital development teams, and somebody from your legal and privacy specialists as well.
Facebook evolution covers measurement within the walled garden, but measurement of open web programmatic is also going to be affected by third-party deprecation. And one of the most significant changes will be to digital attribution. So this currently relies on third-party cookies to link media activity to outcomes in the majority of ways that people do it. Privacy Sandbox, and separately Apple's Safari, has a similar but slightly different technology, has an approach to recover some of this lost functionality, but it will be more limited than today. The key thing that I want to mention here is if you rely on your DSP or another technology provider for your attribution reports, and for that matter for performance reporting as well, then you won't have to do very much to prepare, because they should provide new reports or new versions of existing reports that are using the capabilities that remain after cookies go away. But if you're processing it yourself, if you've got teams of data scientists building models and investigating this directly, including inside things like Google's Cleanroom ADH, then you're going to have much more work to do, because the type of data you're going to have available to you will change, and the techniques that you're used to using may have to be adapted quite significantly. But in both cases, you should also ensure that you build an offline library of benchmark reports now, so that you've got something to compare against when you deal with the post-cookie new style reports, because they won't be exactly the same. And you'll need those benchmarks to help you understand how to adapt the way you do decision-making and analysis to take advantage of the new reports without confusing yourselves. This has been a brief look at a very complex subject, and we've tried our best to be useful within the time available. But we also wanted to start quickly about how we believe that you should be preparing now. And firstly, a reminder that a lot of the future is still being written, but we do know some things for sure. And in particular, expect Google, if they're not already, to push and increasingly push the value of their owned and operated inventory, which will retain one-to-one targeting, even as DV360 shifts to Flock and other privacy sandbox techniques for the open web. And that'll be a big commercial play for them. Obviously, it's very self-interested, but it is going to be easier to measure, it's going to be easier to target, and for some brands, that'll be an entirely appropriate trade-off. Others may be more chary about sending so much of their spend to Google, or increasing a significant portion of spend with Google. So something to watch out for and think about. Secondly, in the future, it's going to be harder to reach all valuable inventory in the same way, including how it's measured. And you'll need to employ a range of different approaches across the different ecosystems of the different sort of buckets of inventory. And you may not be able to directly compare activity and reporting across them, because the reports you get, figures, what reach and frequency actually mean, for instance, may not be the same. This is a little bit like some of the problems that you can have today in trying to compare CTV activity with open programmatic. There's just going to be more buckets that you have to worry about. And even while we wait for more details, which has made it difficult sometimes to take concrete actions, there are a few things that you can do right now to prepare. And going back to the poll that Matt ran at the beginning, I know that the vast majority of you are already on your journey here, but we thought it'd be helpful to share these lists, which we've been using with our clients since earlier this year. While we wait for the promised tests of things like Privacy Sandbox and DV360, full stack tests of UID2 and its expansion into Europe, and while we continue to deal with the ongoing, sometimes random seeming announcements of changes from iOS and Android, there are some concrete things that we're recommending that all of our clients do. You may already be fully on top of this list and have it in your roadmap, but if not, then hopefully this will help you plan some of your next steps as you continue to evolve. And we've got a little bit of time before the half hour if there are any questions, but thank you for your attention so far.
Guys, thank you very much indeed. It's quite a lot to get in, isn't it? And it is extraordinarily complex. Those of you on the webinar, if you have got questions, I haven't seen many come through. If you do have questions, now is the time. So please do stick them in. I have some of my own. Firstly, the ID schema solutions, UID, you've spoken about quite a bit, and Flock, you've spoken about quite a bit. It's basically sort of an expectation that these will become international, but they are, kind of being driven out of the United States. Certainly UID is, and certainly Flock is. I know yes. ID5 is more European. What about the rest of the world? Are these going to get universal adoption, do we think, around the whole world?
I don't think they're going to get completely universal adoption. There is, I think it's called IDX from Retargeting in LATAM, is seeking to be the premier identity solution for Latin America. Obviously, if those can be interoperable with other identity systems, even if the overlap is very, very slight, then there may be opportunities to do interesting things. But for instance, LiveRamp has been around a very long time. They are a declared deterministic identity provider. They have strong volume in the US. and in about half a dozen other markets. And they're putting a lot of effort now into adding more markets to that list. But it's a lot of work for them. Each time they open an Indian market, they have to go and do a whole load of deals, check the data quality, make sure that they're getting decent volumes, check that they're actually accurately identifying people, that the population doesn't work in a slightly unusual fashion, which defeats the way that they're dealing with entity resolution, for instance. So I think it is more likely that we will have a bit of a patchwork, at least for the time being. I think over time, at the moment, I can't remember, when we did the long version of this, there is a slide which has a huge list of identity providers, and I think there's more than 30 in common mainstream use or early adoption, possibly more by now. I don't think all of them will survive. I think we'll have a smaller list. However, it's not going to be clear in most cases which ones those are going to be. That's why interoperability is actually a really useful thing, because it means you can hedge a little bit by choosing one of the interoperable plays and then get access to a number of other identities. And providing some of them survive long term, then that's okay. Flock is slightly different because it's not an individual identity, it's a group identity, and it doesn't interoperate with anything else as such. I think there are certainly potential challenges to making that work under all privacy laws, but it's not impossible. And we know that Google are discussing this with regulators from what we've heard. So we will have to see exactly what they come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by your slide, which shows that actually maybe Flock isn't particularly any worse off in the end. It's sort of less effective, I think, was kind of the outcome from the slide that you showed. I mean, do we know at this point in time, because it's, you know, at the end, it's a certain amount of browsers that you're getting access to. But do we have any, I don't suppose we do, but do we have any kind of indication at this point in time how, you know, how less, someone else just asked this question, how less or more precise, I guess it's less precise, you know, Flock will be, how less effective it'll be, what kind of impact on outcomes in the end might.
At the moment, we only really have Google's word on the internal work they've done. I think a lot of people will have heard a 95% figure. It's quite a specific set of tests that they were doing. They were looking for the ability to replace the way that they generate affinity segments and some of their demographic segments. It will be less precise. My guess is it will be a lot less precise for some use cases, but it will be only marginally less precise for other use cases. And it's going to depend on the kinds of audience you need to reach. So the more that you have very specific niche audiences, the harder or the less likely it is that there are going to be Flock boundaries that help you find them. And in those cases, it might be that you want to take a sort of more mixed approach, where maybe you do some Flock advertising like a slightly targeted open buy, but you then go after some sort of identity-driven approach, and particularly within CTV, because CTV almost entirely is going to provide addressable opportunities, and they are gradually working out the identity approaches there. Although that is still complicated.
We also don't know for sure that less precise is going to mean less effective, I think, because even today we can get some really granular, very precise audiences, but then a lot of the time they won't have the scale that's needed. And so we'll push them into a DSP or another platform and use lookalike modeling to scale those out. I think there's an interesting question about, you know, what that trade-off is when you look at that kind of approach versus a slightly broader option potentially with Flock.
And Flock is, to some extent, effectively, it's got lookalike modeling built into it, because all of the people inside the Flock do look alike each other in some way. I'm just picking up another couple of questions. A lot of people would argue that Flock needs consent. Google is not asking for consent. What would you say about that? Well, Flock at the moment is not live in Europe, so we don't know what Google is going to finally come up with to be compliant with GDPR. I would say that no matter what they do within Chrome, in GDPR, in order to be able to use Flocks for targeting or to be able to record activity against it, you're going to have to seek consent because of the interplay of e-privacy and GDPR right now. That may change in future. And obviously all of this may change in future, and the regulators, most of them are quite pragmatic. And if they see a reasonable argument, then they can look at how the guidance can evolve to support it. Obviously, they can't go in contradiction to the law. And that is a difficulty because of e-privacy, which hasn't been updated in a very long time. So we remain unclear exactly what Google is going to do around GDPR and Flock. But I would say that when you're using it in the way that you use third-party cookies today, where you seek consent through TCF or through some other CMP, you're going to have to do exactly the same thing to be able to use blocks.
I think the encouraging thing, though, is that from what we've heard, at least, Google is actively engaging with a number of different European regulators. And I'm not sure that the same is true for all of the solutions that exist today or are being developed for the post-cookie future.
I think that's fair. I mean, well, I think that's partly fair. I think if we wanted to be slightly more strictly fair, we would point out that Google ran for more than a year with something without going and talking to regulators about it, and they probably should not have done that. I think that was foolish of them because it put them behind on the timeline, and that's now causing a lot of problems. Lauren asked about new KPIs that brands should be looking at for measurement. This is a somewhat high-minded way of answering that, and I'll try and get down to something slightly more practical in a minute. The way that we think about measurement is to try and start as close to business outcomes and the KPIs that drive business success as possible. Those KPIs aren't going to change. Possibly the proxies that you use to measure them might change a little bit. What's more likely to change is things like media metrics, which tell you how well your campaign is doing. So that's where often you use frequency or reach to assess, are you managing to find the people you need? I think the same kinds of KPIs are still going to work. But for instance, the reach is, and I can't remember which way round it is, and Katie may be able to remember. Sorry, it's the end of the week, so I'm not going to try and guess. Reach against the privacy sandbox approaches is going to change. The reported reach will be different to the actual reach in one direction or other, and that will need to be adjusted for. This is why it's so important that we get to the point where we're actually comparing FLoC against alternative approaches, UID against alternative approaches, because by doing that and doing proper measurement analysis underneath it, we will get a really clear idea of, oh, well, with this one and these figures coming out in this way, you need to reduce them by 20%, or you need to, increase your target by dividing by 0.8 or whatever it is. So I think the KPIs are generally going to be the same, but the way that they get calculated will change, and that may mean that the target for them is going to have to shift a little bit. But that does depend on which KPIs you're using. If you're using, for instance, if you're doing direct marketing emails and you're using open rates, then that's going to stop working for a lot of Apple, just completely. iOS 15 will kill that because it will turn the open rate to, I believe, to 100% rather than to 0. I think that's the way that they've chosen to do it, so that you can't tell anything. It just sort of randomly chooses a time to do it. That means that if you're relying on open rates as a proxy for engagement with your email, you're not going to be able to do that anymore, and you're going to have to shift to something else. So there are going to be some specific tactical measures which just stop being useful completely, and you have to change things. So that was a slightly long, rambly answer because it does depend very much on the activity you're doing and how you're trying to manage it and govern things. And as with everything, I would strongly recommend having conversations with whether it is your in-house media team or your agency about how to set and evolve the measures and the management that you're taking.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you guys very much indeed. That was very useful. Anyone left on the call, James and Katie's emails are on screen. You can reach out to them directly if you'd like to get their 3-hour training session, if you haven't had enough of this yet. And maybe they'll be prepared to do that for you. And maybe you guys would also be prepared to share the longer form content with members.
I think we've got versions of some of this that we've used with other WFA teams in the past.
We'll share this version.
We'll figure out what we can usefully share.
You've got something, I'm sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again for presenting. Very complex. You did a good job, though. Really enjoyed that. Thanks to everyone who attended the session. I hope you enjoyed it. And as I say, we'll try to do more of these sessions because I think it's useful to hear the same thing again from other perspectives as well. I think we need to be constantly talking about this over the coming weeks and months. Right, everyone. I hope you'll have a lovely weekend. Thanks again for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.